As always, before we start, I need to warn you. But this warning's a little bit different. Usually I warn you that the episode's gonna get dark. But this episode, I'm warning you that if you're looking for the darkest one, you may want to skip on or slow down. Because this is the one episode that has something the other episodes didn't have. It has the way out. And honestly, after 7 episodes of revenge, obsession, poisoned banquets, sunken ships, and a woman who kept a dead man in her bed for 40 years, I think we've both earned a little bit of respite from that. Now, in this channel, we've spent 7 episodes examining revenge. And every time we built a new episode, we did something. We reflected on what the previous episodes had in common, and then we tried to enlarge the boundaries a little bit each time in every episode so that you get a little something different. And we'll do the same thing here. We'll keep that tradition going. In this channel, we've seen men who dismantled lives with surgical patience. We've seen women who burned everything down, including themselves. We've seen a man who was framed for his wife's murder that she engineered. We've seen families curse themselves for generations. In the darkest episode, I believe, we saw a man feed his brother's own children and call it justice. In one of the weirdest episodes, we saw a woman keep a dead man in her bed for 40 years. And in the most recent episode, we saw a captain take his entire crew to the bottom of the ocean chasing something that, well, quite frankly, never knew that captain existed. And if you're looking for a common denominator in all those episodes, well, I would say that it would be that every single one of those people went out into the world to do what they did. They moved, they acted, they made choices, either dark, terrible, or sometimes magnificent choices, but they made them out there in the world. But today's subject, well, she never leaves her house. She doesn't need to. Instead, she decides to build something. And that something that she builds, she aims at the world from the safety of a room where every clock is stopped. And the depiction of that time represents the worst moment of her life and the fact that she can't get past that moment. But here's what's different. Here's why episode 8 matters in a way that goes beyond the darkness. Because Miss Havisham finds a way out. It doesn't come easily, it doesn't come without cost, and it doesn't come without damage that couldn't be undone. But she finds it. And after everything we've covered on this channel, I think that's the most important thing Dark Margins has said yet. That somewhere, somehow, someone found the way out of the cycle. This is Miss Havisham from Great Expectations, written by Charles Dickens and published in 1861. And just as a side note, before you pass this up and say, well, whatever, what does Charles Dickens know? Realize Charles Dickens is one of the greatest storytellers ever. If you don't believe me, look to one of his stories titled The Tale of Two Cities. If you've heard of that but haven't listened to it, I suggest you go to it. It's absolutely phenomenal. But more importantly, one of the most powerful movies as of today, the finale of the Dark Knight series, The Dark Knight Rises, was written based upon The Tale of Two Cities. It incorporates even some of the same lines that was used in 1861 and put back in. There's a lot of imagery that's similar. Christopher Nolan even goes on to talk about how The Tale of Two Cities inspired the trilogy. So, or not the trilogy, I apologize, the finale of the trilogy. So, don't write off Charles Dickens just yet. In fact, not only can he do great stories like that, he can also get dark. And in doing this episode, I wanted to prove that in going through this thing. Well, how dark can Charles Dickens really get? I'm going to put out an episode in the Sounds of Stories. And if you don't know what the Sounds of Stories is, it's just a channel that I do. You're in Dark Margins right now. You can go over to the Sounds of Stories and listen to The Signal Man. That's going to be my next episode on the Sounds of Stories. The Signal Man, written by Charles Dickens. It gets dark. I'm going to do a reimagining of it, so it's going to be a little bit different. I believe that my reimaginings have been pretty good, so I would take a listen to it. But anyways, let's get back to Miss Havisham. She is without question the most psychologically complex character this channel's ever examined. And the first person we've covered who chose, however late, however painfully, to stop. Now, before we get into what Miss Havisham does, we need to understand what was done to her. Because like every person we've covered on this channel, the wound came first. And in Miss Havisham's case, the wound was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It wasn't a man who lost his nerve or changed his mind. It was a professional. His name is Compeyson, and I want you to understand who Compeyson is before we go any further, because most people who know this story think of him as simply the man who left Miss Havisham at the altar. And that description's as accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. Compeyson is a career criminal, educated, well-spoken, handsome, the kind of man who learned very early in life that his appearance and his manners could open doors that his character would never deserve to walk through. He's not a man who fell into dishonesty out of desperation. No, he chose it. Deliberately, systematically, he specialized in forgery, fraud, and the manipulation of people who trusted him. And he didn't stumble into Miss Havisham's life by accident. He targeted her. She was one of the wealthiest unmarried women in the region. Emotionally sheltered, raised in privilege, not particularly experienced in reading the intentions of men who wanted something from her rather than simply wanting her. She was, in the language of what Compeyson did for a living, an ideal mark. And here's the part that takes this from painful to genuinely sinister. Compeyson had help. He was working with a man named Arthur, who was Miss Havisham's own half-brother. Arthur had already helped drain some of the Havisham family money, and he was working with Compeyson to extract more. So, the relationship between Compeyson and Miss Havisham wasn't just a con. It was a coordinated, premeditated fraud with multiple people involved, including someone from inside her own family targeting her specifically. And the worst part is, she never knew any of this. She thought she was falling in love. But he was running a job. And he was good at it. By all accounts in the novel, the courtship was convincing enough that Miss Havisham fell completely. And I want to be careful here not to imply that she was naive or foolish, because she wasn't. She was an intelligent woman, but Compeyson was a professional. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to behave, and exactly how much affection to show and when to show it. He was performing a role he had likely performed before. He also, and Dickens implies this without stating it explicitly, extracted significant money from Miss Havisham during the courtship itself. This wasn't just an emotional con, it was financial. By the time the wedding morning arrived, she had given him her trust, her love, and a substantial portion of her fortune. And then, the morning arrived, and Compeyson was gone. Not dramatically, not with a confrontation or an explanation, or even the dignity of saying it to her face. No, he sent a letter, and then disappeared. Now here's something I want you to notice about how Dickens handles this moment, because it matters more than it seems. And that's that Dickens never shows us the letter, not one word of it. We know it exists, we know it arrives at 20 minutes to 9 on the morning of her wedding, we know what it costs her, but for some reason, Dickens makes a deliberate choice to keep those words from us entirely. And that's one of the many good decisions by Dickens in this novel, because he understood that some wounds don't need to be described to be felt. Whatever Compeyson wrote in that letter, whatever words he used to walk away from a woman who had given him everything, your imagination's going to fill that in right now. And whatever you imagine is probably more devastating than anything Dickens could have written explicitly. And the letter's not really the point anyway. What Miss Havisham does in that moment after she reads it, that's the point. Miss Havisham reads the letter at 20 minutes to 9 in the morning of her wedding, and she stops every clock in the house at that exact moment, 20 to 9. She never takes off the wedding dress. She never opens the curtains. She had one shoe off when the letter arrived and hadn't finished dressing, and she never puts the other one on. She leaves the wedding cake on the table, and she never, not once, steps outside the walls of Sadie's house again. Now, before we judge that, before we say she should have moved on, let's take a moment. Because here's what I've learned about spending time with these stories, and here's what I think Dark Margins is really about underneath all the revenge and the darkness and the psychology. That most of us, we have a sadist house. Doesn't look like a Victorian mansion with stopped clocks and a rotting wedding cake, but it does exist. It is real, and a lot of us are living in there right now. And if you don't believe me, let's just think about this for a second. How many people do you know, and I'm talking about good people, intelligent people, people with everything going for them, who stop going to the gym after one embarrassing moment? Not because they're lazy, but because that room became the place where something happened that they haven't processed yet. Or how many people do you know who won't go back to church after a relationship ended there? Not because their faith is gone, but because walking through that door means feeling something they're not ready to feel yet. If none of those, how about how many people stop pursuing a career they love because one rejection, one letter that said no, one door that closed, and the letter or that door convinced them that the universe had made its decision about them personally? Have we rang any bells? Do we see a little bit of empathy there? If not, how many people are still in the same city, the same job, the same apartment? Not because it's where they want to be, but because leaving would mean admitting that something's over. And admitting it's over means feeling the loss. And feeling the loss is the one thing they can't bring themselves to do. Miss Havisham stopped every clock in her house. We do the same thing, we just do it differently. We stop answering texts from certain people. We stop going to certain restaurants. We stop listening to certain songs or stop driving down certain streets. We build our own version of drawn curtains and stopped clocks around places and people and memories that hurt us, and we call it moving on. But here's the thing about avoidance that the research is absolutely clear on. It works. In the short term, avoidance works beautifully. If you don't go back to the gym, you don't have to feel embarrassed. If you don't answer the phone call, you don't have to have that conversation. If you don't drive down that street, you don't have to feel that feeling. The problem is that the wound doesn't heal while you're avoiding it. It just waits. Psychologists call this experiential avoidance. And what they found consistently across decades of research is that the more energy a person puts into avoiding a painful feeling, the more powerful that feeling becomes. The avoided thing grows in the dark. It fills more space the less you look at it, until eventually, like Miss Havisham's rotting wedding cake, it's consuming the entire room, even though you're pretending it isn't there. And here's the part that really gets me about this. The loss that Miss Havisham was avoiding by stopping those clocks. That loss has already happened. Compeyson was already gone. The wedding was already over. The morning was already lost. Stopping the clocks didn't change any of that. All it did was make sure she kept losing every single day for decades. Because when you refuse to feel a loss, when you build a house around the moment before it happened and live in there, you don't escape the loss, you just make it permanent. You make yourself live in the worst moment of your life every morning for your entire existence, which is exactly what Miss Havisham did. Now, I'm not here to judge her, I'm genuinely not, because what was done to her was real and devastating and premeditated by people who should have protected her. But I am here to say, to anyone listening right now who has a stopped clock somewhere, the thing you're avoiding feeling, you're already feeling it. You've been feeling it every day you've been avoiding it. The only difference is you're feeling it alone, in the dark, without anyone to witness it. And that isolation, that refusal to be witnessed in your pain, is the thing that keeps the clock stopped. Miss Havisham's clock started again the moment Pip stood in front of her and witnessed what she had been carrying, not judging it, not attacking it, just seeing it. That's what it takes. Someone who loves you enough to stand in front of you and see you clearly. And it takes you being willing, however late, however painful, to let them see you. Now, this is where the story moves from tragedy into something that requires a different kind of conversation entirely. Miss Havisham adopts a little girl named Estella. I want you to hold on to something while I tell you this part, because it's easy to hear what Miss Havisham does with Estella and just call her a monster and move on, but that's not what Dark Margins does. We try to understand how people become what they become, and in doing so, we have to see the wound underneath the weapon. But first, before we get into the weapon or the wound, I want to tell you who Estella actually is, because most people who know the story don't know the full picture. Estella's not just an orphan Miss Havisham chose randomly. Estella's biological father is Magwitch, a convict, a man who destroyed in court by the same Compeyson who destroyed Miss Havisham, the same professional criminal who targeted and defrauded the woman who would adopt his daughter. Dickens connects everything in this novel in a way that is almost architectural. The man who ruined Miss Havisham is the same man who ruined the father of the child Miss Havisham adopts. That's not coincidence. That's Dickens showing us how cruelty travels, how one man's predatory choice ripple outward and touch people who never knew each other, across year, across classes, across the entire social structure of Victorian England. Oh, that's Estella's father. Let's bring in her mother real quick. Stella's biological mother is a woman named Molly. She works as a housekeeper for a lawyer named Jaggers. Molly was tried for murder. Jaggers defends her and wins. But before the trial, Jaggers took the child, arranged the adoption with Miss Havisham, and kept Estella's existence secret from everyone, including Magwitch himself. Estella never knew any of this. She grew up knowing only Sadie's house, only Miss Havisham, only the world of stopped clocks and rotting cake and the systematic dismantling of her capacity to feel. She has no biological family she knew of, no origin stories she could point to and say, "That's where I came from, that's what I'm outside of what you made me." Which makes what Estella does later, and we'll get there, even more remarkable. Because she finds her way towards something better completely blind. Without a map, without a model, without anyone who had ever shown her what she was fighting toward. But we'll get back to that in a second. Let's get back to Miss Havisham's decision. So, she adopts this child, and she makes a plan. Estella is beautiful. She's intelligent. She's perceptive in the way children who grew up in unusual circumstances become perceptive. She reads every room she walks into because, well, she has to. And Miss Havisham sees all of that, and she begins to shape her. She shapes her deliberately and systematically, with the patience of a woman who has nothing but time and the precision of a woman who has thought about almost nothing else. She teaches Estella that love is a trap, that men are predators disguised as suitors, that the heart is something to be eliminated, not developed, not given, not trusted, but eliminated. That the only safe position in any relationship is the position of the person who feels nothing while the other person feels everything. And Miss Havisham teaches her to be cold, to be beautiful, to attract and then withdraw, to offer just enough warmth to pull someone in completely and then close the door. Now think about that in the context of what we've covered on this channel. Medea burned everything down with her own hands. Atreus constructed the most devastating meal in literary history. Amy Doone engineered a false murder with months of meticulous planning. All of them got their hands dirty. But Miss Havisham never gets hers dirty. With hers, she builds a weapon. She aims it, and then she lets it go into the world. And that weapon has a name. It's Estella. Now, after all that coaching and teaching and grooming and deceptiveness, let's see how Miss Havisham's plans worked. Miss Havisham brings in a boy named Pip. He's a blacksmith's apprentice, young, honest, completely unprepared for what he's walking into. Now, I'll give you the full picture of Pip and Estella because this is not a simple story and it doesn't play out in a single encounter. This is a relationship that spans the entire novel, and understanding it fully changes how you see everything Miss Havisham built. When Pip first arrives at the sadist's house, he's approximately 7 or 8 years old. Estella's perhaps a year or two older, somewhere between 8 and 10. They're children, and I want you to hold on to that for a moment because Miss Havisham's decision to bring in a child at that time rather than a grown man later on in Estella's life is not incidental. It's the point. She understands something about human psychology that most people never consciously articulate. What forms in childhood, love, attachment, the sense of who we are and what we deserve, that doesn't respond to adult reasoning. It doesn't update when we get older and wiser and should know better. All it does is stay. So, she brings in Pip as a child and lets Estella practice on him. And Pip, 7 years old, a blacksmith's boy walking into the most unusual house he's ever seen in his life, looks at Estella. And something forms in him that will never fully leave. Estella's cold to him, contemptuous. She calls him a common laboring boy. She remarks on his coarse hands, his thick boots, his ignorance of things that her world considers basic. She's not cruel in a dramatic way, she's just simply indifferent, as if he barely qualifies as a person worth addressing directly. So, being devastated, Pip goes home and cries. And then, he comes back. And that's the imprint. That's the moment Miss Havisham created deliberately that will shape the next decade of Pip's life. He doesn't fall in love with Estella as an adult making a considered choice, and that decision matters enormously because feelings formed in childhood don't respond to adult logic. You can't reason your way out of them. You can't simply decide they're irrational and move past them. They're written at a level beneath reason. And Miss Havisham knew this. That's why she did that at this time. She wasn't bringing in a grown man later when Estella was older who might have the emotional resources to protect himself. She was bringing in a child because a child was the perfect audience for the weapon she had built. Well, Pip visits Sadie's house multiple times over several years. Each visit deepens what he feels. Each visit, Estella performs the coldness she's been taught, beautiful, consistently, without cruelty beyond what is necessary. And Miss Havisham watches from her chair in her rotting wedding dress and feeds on every moment of it. Now, if you think all that's confusing, well, get ready because here's where the story gets even more complicated. Pip grows up. He comes into money, unexpectedly, anonymously. Someone arranges for him to receive a fortune and become a gentleman. And I want you to hold that next to something for just a second, because if you've been following Dark Margins from the beginning, and when I say the beginning, I mean the first episode, this is going to land in an interesting way. Because if you remember, that first episode's about Edmond Dantes, and both Pip and Edmond Dantes are transformed by unexpected wealth that comes from a hidden source. Edmond finds a treasure on an island that a dying man told him about. Pip receives a fortune from a benefactor he can't identify. Both of them use that wealth to enter a world that previously had no place for them. And both of them spend a significant portion of their story operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about where that money actually came from. But here's the difference. Edmond Dantes knew exactly what his treasure was for. He had a plan, he had targets, he had 13 years of patience behind every move he made. Pip, well, he has no plans at all. He just has hope. Hope that the money means what he wants it to mean. Hope that it came from who he thinks it came from. And hope that becoming a gentleman will close the distance between him and a girl in a stopped house who was taught never to feel anything for anyone. Edmond Dantes used his fortune as a weapon. Pip used his as a prayer. And in some ways, Pip's version is the more heartbreaking of the two, because at least Edmund knew what he was doing. Pip spent years becoming a gentleman for a reason that turned out not to be a reason at all. The money didn't come from Miss Havisham, it came from Magwitch, the convict on the marshes, Estella's biological father. It's the man that was destroyed by the same Compeyson who destroyed Miss Havisham. Like I said earlier, Dickens connects everything in this novel. Every thread leads back to the same wound, and every life in this story was touched by the same man's cruelty. Compeyson didn't just destroy Miss Havisham. He set in motion a chain of events that shaped Pip, Estella, Magwitch, and Molly, people who never even knew each other across decades. I told you, Dickens is one of the greatest storytellers ever. And that's Dickens' way of showing us something true about how damage works in the real world. It doesn't stay where it lands, it travels. It finds people who had nothing to do with the original wound, and it changes them too. Now, Pip moves to London. He becomes a gentleman. He encounters Estella in society. And she is everything Miss Havisham built her to be. Polished, beautiful, devastating in every room she enters. She moves through London society with the particular ease of someone who has been trained since childhood to attract and then withdraw. Men fall for her constantly, but she feels nothing for any of them. And Pip watches all of this and loves her anyway. And he loves her with that particular stubbornness of someone who formed that attachment at 7 years old and has never fully been able to put it down. And here's where Dickens does something that separates Great Expectations from a simple revenge narrative. He makes Estella complicated. And I want to give her the same kind of empathy we're given to every character on this channel, because Estella deserves it more than most. And here's what I mean. Estella knows what she is. She has no illusions about the weapon she's been made into. She understands the architecture of her own coldness, where it came from, who built it, what it was built to do. And using that knowledge, she warns Pip. Directly, clearly, multiple times throughout their acquaintance. She says, "I have no heart, I have no softness, I have no sentiment. Don't love me." Now, it has to take a lot to say something like that. This is a person who was shaped before she had any choice in the matter, whose capacity for feeling was deliberately dismantled by the person who raised her. Estella grew up without knowing where she came from or who her real parents were or what she might have been in different circumstances. And in front of that person, Dickens puts someone there who loves them unconditionally, and all that person can say is, "Don't." That's not the behavior of someone who has fully surrendered to what she was made into. That's the behavior of someone who can see the damage she does and hasn't found a way to stop doing it yet. But she refuses to pretend that it isn't happening. And I want to take a moment to connect that to something we all deal with. How many of us have been shaped by something, a parent, a wound, a relationship we didn't choose, and found ourselves doing things we knew weren't right, but couldn't stop doing them yet? Estella is that, at a level most of us can't imagine. She was made into something, and she had no choice in that. But she chose honesty about what she was. And telling the truth about who you are, even when you can't change it yet, that keeps the door open. And then, Estella makes a decision that is, when you understand it fully, one of the most complicated acts of resistance in the entire novel. She marries someone. And for all you lovebirds out there, unfortunately, it's not Pip. It's a man named Bentley Drummle. Now, on the surface, this looks like the final cruelty. The woman Pip loves choosing someone else, but let's take a moment and look a little closer. Estella doesn't love Drummle. She feels nothing for him either. He's brutal and coarse and exactly the kind of man that a woman with healthy attachment would never choose. But here's why she chooses him. He's rough enough, brutal enough, independent enough that Miss Havisham can't use this marriage as a weapon anymore. He'll not be manipulated. He'll not be aimed. He exists outside the architecture of what Miss Havisham built. In her own deeply damaged way, Estella is trying to put something between herself and the woman who made her. Now, I'm not encouraging that. I'm not saying it's a healthy choice. The marriage is deeply unhealthy. Drummle is cruel to her in ways that cause real suffering. But it is, in its own painful and perfect way, an act of resistance. And here's what happens at the end. Drummle, well, he dies. And with that death, Dickens gives us two endings. And the fact that he wrote it twice tells us something important. In the original ending, Pip and Estella meet briefly as adults. She's remarried, a doctor this time, a gentler man. They part as friendly acquaintances. Nothing romantic remains. The damage Miss Havisham did was too complete and too lasting to be undone. But then, Dickens rewrote it. And the revised ending, and the one most readers know, they meet in the ruins of Sadie's house at night, the house itself finally demolished. The stopped clock's gone, the rotting cake gone, the wedding dress gone. And in those ruins, Pip sees in his words no shadow of another parting from her. Dickens couldn't decide. He wrote it sad, and then he wrote it open. And I think that ambiguity is the most honest thing he could have done, because the question of whether two people shaped by damage like this can find their way to something whole, it doesn't necessarily have a clean answer. What we know is that Estella suffered, that the marriage to Drummle cost her something real, and that suffering, as painful as it was, may have been the thing that finally cracked open what Miss Havisham had sealed. Because Estella, in this story, comes out of that marriage knowing something she didn't know before. And that is what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a cruel hand that you didn't choose. And sometimes, that's how the door opens. Not through wisdom or therapy or someone standing in front of you and witnessing your pain, but sometimes it opens through suffering that finally makes the wound visible from inside. And before we end this story, let's get back to Miss Havisham real quick. Years have passed. Pip's grown up. He's come into money. He's moved to London. He's watched Estella move through society, breaking hearts the way she's built to do. And then, in one of the most quietly powerful scenes in Victorian literature, Pip stands before Miss Havisham, and he tells her what she has done. Not to him, to Estella. He says, "You let me love her. You watched me love her. You encouraged it, knowing she had no heart to give. And you did the same to others before me. And you called it justice." Let's stop here for a second, because I want you to understand how Pip says this. He doesn't attack her, he doesn't shame her, and he doesn't come into anger. He comes in the form of grief. He stands in front of this woman in her rotting wedding dress, in her stopped house, in her frozen world, and he describes clearly and specifically and without cruelty what she's built and who it hurt and what it cost. And Miss Havisham, who's been so careful not to see herself for so long, finally does see herself. And she says something that stops everything. "What have I done?" After decades of frozen time, after a weapon built from a child, after years of damage deployed against people who never wronged her, those words came out. That means she stepped outside the stopped clock for the first time at that moment, and that's when she could finally see herself. Now, shortly after this scene, and I want to be careful how I say this because this is one of those moments in literature where the symbolism is almost too perfect. Miss Havisham's wedding dress catches fire. The details of exactly how aren't the point, but what matters is the image. The rotting dress, the stopped clock, the wedding cake that's been sitting on the table for decades, all of it, the entire physical architecture of her revenge, is burning. Now, she survives. She's badly burned, but she does survive, and she lives long enough to do two things that matter enormously to this episode. She begs Pip's forgiveness, and she writes him a letter asking to put one specific thing on her tombstone. Not, she was right, not, she was wronged, but, I forgive her. Now, that's what you need to sit with for a moment. This woman, Miss Havisham, who stopped every clock, who built a child into a weapon, who never once stepped outside, her dying wish is to be remembered as someone who was forgiven. Not justified, not vindicated, but forgiven. That shift right there from needing to be right to needing to be forgiven, that's an amazing thing in all of literature. I've read a lot of books, that's up there. Because that shift is what breaking a cycle of revenge actually looks like from inside. She didn't make it all the way out. The fire came before she could fully reckon with everything she built and aimed and deployed. But she broke down one of those walls, and that breakdown, that's everything. So, here's what 8 episodes of Dark Margins has been building toward. Because we've covered a lot of ground together, and every single story, every single one, ended the same way. The cycle continued, well, except for one of the stories, and that was the House of Atreus, where finally Athena stepped in and broke the cycle for them, but as far as human endeavors were concerned, the cycle never stopped. It took an act of one of the Greek gods to stop one cycle, but outside of that, they all stayed the same. The cycle continued. Edmond Dantes felt doubt, but he never fully stopped. Medea had no doubt, and she destroyed the version of herself that had something worth protecting. Amy Doon couldn't stop. The plan always needed a new target. The House of Atreus cycled until a goddess had to physically intervene. Like we just said, Atreus felt nothing and poisoned everyone who came after him. Emily Grierson never understood what she did even had a name. And like we said in the beginning of the episode, Ahab took down a ship full of his own men to the bottom of the ocean, chasing something that never knew Ahab existed. And then came Miss Havisham, who stopped every clock in her house at 20 to 9, who built a child into a weapon, who watched decades of damage unfold from a chair in a rotting dress, and who, when a boy from a blacksmith stood in front of her and told her the truth, actually heard it. Now, here's what I want to share with you from a psychological standpoint, because this matters for all of us, not for just understanding the story, but for understanding ourselves. The research on breaking revenge cycles is consistent, and it's clear. The cycle doesn't break through exhaustion, it doesn't break through the damage running out of targets, it doesn't break through external intervention alone, it breaks through witness. When a person trapped in a revenge cycle is genuinely seen, now not judged, not attacked, not confronted in anger, but truly witnessed in what they're doing and what it's costing, something becomes possible that wasn't possible before. Pip didn't come to Miss Havisham with accusations. He came with grief. He described what he saw. He named what it had cost. He stood in front of her as a witness. And Miss Havisham, who had been so careful not to see herself, finally did see herself. Psychologists call this the crack in the narrative. And here's what that actually means. Every revenge cycle is sustained by a story about who wronged you and why what you're doing is justified. And that story becomes the stopped clock, the frozen moment you live inside because stepping outside it means feeling everything you've been very carefully not feeling. That crack comes when the story becomes impossible to maintain, when the damage you've done becomes more visible than the damage done to you. When you look at what you've built, in Miss Havisham's case, a human being shaped into a weapon, and you can't call it justice anymore. Miss Havisham didn't have enough time after the crack to fully rebuild, but she did have that one moment. And here's what I want to leave you with today. Here's what I think makes episode 8 the most important episode Dark Margins has done. If that crack had come for a woman who stopped every clock in her house, who never once stepped outside, who built a child into a weapon and aimed her at the world for decades, well, then it can come for anyone. Which means the stopped clock can start again. Now, it won't start easily, and it won't start without cost, and it won't be without sitting in front of someone who loves you enough to tell you the truth, but it can start. And Estella, the weapon Miss Havisham built, she was finding her way out too. Remember that. She warned Pip repeatedly, honestly, without the tools or the model or even the language for what she was trying to do. She chose a marriage that was its own painful form of resistance. And she came out of that marriage carrying a wound that finally made her own damage visible from the outside. And then she met Pip again in the ruins of the house where it all began. Whether they found their way to something whole, Dickens couldn't decide. He wrote it twice and left the answer open. But Estella was still there, still standing, still reaching towards something she had never been shown and had no map for. That reaching, that persistent, imperfect, costly reaching toward something better than what we were made into, that's the most hopeful thing Dark Margins has ever examined. Every person we've covered on this channel was genuinely wronged. Every wound was real. And every cycle, without exception, cost the person inside it more than it cost the people it was aimed at. The research on this is not ambiguous. Sustained revenge activates the same neurological stress response as the original trauma, which means the person inside the cycle isn't healing between acts of revenge. They're only re-traumatizing themselves. And they do it every single day they maintain it. Miss Havisham lived in the worst morning of her life every morning for decades. The crack came late, the fire came before she could fully use it, but it did come. And that means something for every person listening to this today who has a clock they stopped somewhere. The clock can start again. That's what this episode's about. Now, Great Expectations is one of Dickens's longer novels, but I want to tell you something. It reads faster than its length suggests, because Pip's voice is one of the most compelling in all of Victorian literature. He pulls you in, and he doesn't let you go. If you read nothing else, though, read the chapter where Pip first visits Sada's house, and read the chapter where he stands in front of Miss Havisham and tells her the truth. Those two chapters together are this entire episode in about 40 pages. And realize it's public domain, it's free. I always say I'll link it in the description, and yet I never do, so I'll link it in the description. But now for next time, we go somewhere we haven't been on Dark Margins. Because next episode is about someone who was wronged, genuinely, completely, systematically wronged over 27 years. And this person chose not to take revenge. Not because he was weak, and not because he didn't have the means or the reason or the legitimate grievance, but because he understood something that Edmond Dantes and Medea and Ahab and Miss Havisham never fully grasped. That forgiveness, not justice, not revenge, not cycles or weapons or stopped clocks, but forgiveness is the most powerful response available. It's the hardest episode Dark Margins has written ever, because forgiveness is harder than revenge every time. I promise you, you're not going to want to miss it. Subscribe. I'm Bobby Garrison. This is Dark Margins, and I'll see you in the next chapter.